The year was 1847, and in the dusty frontier town of Millbrook, Arizona Territory, a single act of courage would forever change two lives and challenge everything the townspeople believed about honor, sacrifice, and redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Edward Callahan had been riding the cattle trails for nearly 15 years when he first set foot in Millbrook. The town sat like a weathered scar against the red desert landscape, its wooden buildings bleached white by the relentless Arizona sun. Dust devils danced between the general store and the saloon, carrying with them the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Edward wasn't much to look at average height, weathered face marked by years under the open sky, and hands that bore the calluses of a man who'd spent his life working with rope and leather. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Copper, had carried him through 3 states and countless towns just like this one. But something about Millbrook felt different. Maybe it was the tension that hung in the air like morning mist, or the way conversations stopped when strangers walked by. The cowboy had come to Millbrook following a lead on work. Word had traveled down the cattle routes that Samuel Morrison, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, was hiring experienced hands for a massive drive north to the railroad. The pay was good, better than good, and Edward's savings had dwindled to little more than pocket change after a harsh winter in Colorado. Morrison's ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of high desert, bordered on one side by a mountain range that caught the morning light like jagged teeth. The ranch house itself was an impressive structure of adobe and timber, speaking to the wealth Morrison had accumulated over 2 decades of successful cattle operations. But it was what Edward saw on his way to the main house that made his stomach tighten with unease. Along the eastern edge of Morrison's property, barely visible from the main road, stood a collection of ramshackle structures that could generously be called a settlement. Smoke rose from cook fires, and Edward could make out figures moving between the crude shelters. He'd seen enough frontier towns to recognize a displaced native community when he saw one. These were Tohono O'odham people, he learned later, who had been living on this land for generations before Morrison arrived with his papers and his cattle. The legal battles had been swift and merciless. Federal authorities had ruled in Morrison's favor, as they always did. But rather than force the native families to relocate entirely, some arrangement had been reached. The details were murky, but the result was clear. The Tohono O'odham now lived as laborers on land that had once been theirs, working Morrison's cattle and maintaining his property for wages that barely covered their basic needs. Edward met Morrison on a Tuesday morning in late September. The rancher was a big man with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from years of getting his way. He looked Edward up and down with calculating eyes, taking in the worn but well-maintained gear, the steady gaze, and the way the cowboy held himself. "You come recommended by Dutch Peterson down in Tucson," Morrison said, settling behind his massive oak desk. "The Dutch say you know cattle and you don't cause trouble. Is that true?" "I do my job and mind my own business," Edward replied. "Been working cattle since I was 16. Never missed a drive, never lost a herd." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. I need men who understand their place. This operation runs smoothly because everyone knows the rules and follows them. You'll be working with my crew chief, Frank Holloway. He'll show you the ropes, explain how things work around here." The pay Morrison offered was indeed generous, more than Edward had made in his last 3 jobs combined. But as he shook hands with the rancher, sealing the agreement, something in Morrison's eyes suggested there might be more to this job than simple cattle work. Frank Holloway turned out to be a lean, hard man with sun-damaged skin and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been with Morrison for 8 years, he told Edward, and in that time had learned to appreciate the benefits of working for a man who rewarded loyalty and dealt harshly with problems. "The boss has built something special here," Holloway explained, as he led Edward on a tour of the ranch facilities. "But it takes constant vigilance to maintain it. The cattle business is tough enough without outside interference." When they reached the equipment shed, Edward noticed something that made him pause. Hanging on the wall among the bridles and ropes were several leather whips, not the kind used for moving cattle, but heavier, more brutal implements designed for a different purpose entirely. "Those aren't for the livestock," Holloway said, noticing Edward's gaze. "Sometimes we have discipline problems among the workers. Morrison believes in maintaining order through clear consequences." Edward said nothing, but something cold settled in his chest. He'd worked for hard men before, ranchers who demanded long hours and accepted no excuses. But there was something different here, something that went beyond the normal harsh realities of frontier life. Over the following weeks, Edward threw himself into the work with his usual dedication. The cattle were in good condition, and the other ranch hands seemed competent, if quietly watchful. But gradually, he began to understand the true nature of Morrison's operation, that the Tohono O'odham workers lived under conditions that bordered on servitude. Their wages were paid in credit at Morrison's company store, where prices were inflated far beyond what the same goods cost in town. Any worker who fell behind on their debts faced harsh penalties, reduced rations, longer hours, or worse. And if anyone spoke out against the system or tried to leave, they were brought before Morrison for what he called corrective measures. Edward witnessed his first such session on a gray October morning. A young native man named Joseph Redhawk had been caught trying to leave the ranch with his family in the middle of the night. Morrison's men had brought him back, and now the entire native community had been assembled to watch his punishment. "This is what happens," Morrison announced to the gathered crowd, "when people forget their obligations and try to break their agreements with me." Joseph was tied to a post in the center of the compound. Morrison selected one of the heavy whips from the shed and handed it to Holloway. The first strike across Joseph's back drew blood and a strangled cry. By the fifth strike, the young man had passed out. They revived him with cold water and continued. Edward stood with the other ranch hands, watching in sick fascination as Morrison made his point. Around them, the Tohono O'odham families watched in silent horror, many holding small children who pressed their faces against their parents' clothing to avoid seeing the brutality. It was then that Edward noticed her, a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing near the front of the crowd. Unlike the other children, she wasn't hiding her face. Instead, she stared directly at Morrison with an expression of pure, undiluted hatred that seemed far too old for her young features. Her name was Little Dove, he learned later. Her father was Thomas Greyhorse, one of the most respected men in the community and someone Morrison particularly enjoyed humiliating. Little Dove had been born on this land, before the papers and the lawyers and the cattle. To her, every sunrise over the mountains, every drop of water from the ancient well, every blade of grass was part of her heritage. After Joseph's punishment ended and the crowd dispersed, Edward found himself thinking about that little girl's eyes. There had been no fear in them, only a burning defiance that reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten about himself. That night, he sat on the porch of the bunkhouse, watching the lights flicker in the native settlement. The other ranch hands were inside, playing cards and drinking Morrison's whiskey, but Edward needed the cool air and the silence to process what he'd seen. The punishment of Joseph Redhawk wasn't an aberration, he realized. It was the foundation of Morrison's entire system. Fear kept the workers in line, and public displays of brutality ensured that fear remained fresh and sharp. Morrison had built his prosperity on the backs of people who had no choice but to endure whatever he decided to inflict upon them. Edward had grown up poor in Texas, the son of a farmer who'd lost everything to drought and debt. He'd learned early that the world was divided between those who had power and those who didn't. and he'd spent most of his adult life trying to stay invisible to both. But watching that little girl's defiant stare had awakened something in him that he'd thought was long dead. The next few weeks passed in a haze of routine work and careful observation. Edward learned the patterns of the ranch, the schedules of the guards, and the subtle ways in which Morrison maintained his control. He also began to pay attention to the native community in a way he never had before. Thomas Greyhorse worked as Morrison's head stable manager, a position that required him to interact regularly with the ranch hands and oversee the care of nearly 100 horses. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Despite the circumstances of his situation, he carried himself with dignity and commanded respect from both his own people and many of Morrison's men. Little Dove, Edward discovered, was Thomas's only child. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Thomas had raised her alone while navigating the increasingly difficult realities of their displaced community. The girl was bright and curious, with a gift for languages that allowed her to speak fluent English alongside her native Tohono. ODHAM. She was also absolutely fearless in ways that terrified the adults around her. Edward first spoke with Little Dove on a morning when he'd come to the stables early to check on a horse with a suspected injury. She was there ahead of him, carefully brushing down a mare that had been overworked the day before. "You're the new cowboy," she said without looking up from her work. "The one who watches everything but doesn't say anything." Edward paused, surprised by her directness. "I suppose that's one way to put it. My father says quiet men are either very wise or very dangerous." She glanced up at him with those remarkable eyes. "Which are you?" "I haven't decided yet," Edward replied honestly. Little Dove nodded, as if this answer satisfied her completely. "This horse needs rest, but the foreman will work her anyway. She go lame before winter." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Edward examined the mare's legs and found signs of strain that confirmed the girl's assessment. "You know horses well." "I know everything that happens on this ranch," Little Dove said with calm certainty. "I see what the adults pretend not to notice." There was something unsettling about the conversation, but Edward found himself drawn back to the stables over the following days. Little Dove was usually there, and gradually their brief exchanges evolved into longer talks. She told him about the land as it had been before Morrison, about the seasonal migrations her people had followed for centuries, and about the sacred places that were now pastures for cattle. In return, Edward found himself sharing stories of his own travels, describing mountains and rivers and towns he'd seen during his years on the cattle trails. Little Dove listened with the intense focus of someone hungry for knowledge of the world beyond the ranch's boundaries. It was during one of these conversations that Edward realized he was being watched. Frank Holloway stood in the doorway of the stable, his cold eyes taking in the scene with obvious disapproval. "Morrison wants to see you, Callahan," Holloway said. "Now." Edward felt his stomach tighten as he followed Holloway across the yard to the ranch house. Morrison was waiting in his office, seated behind the oak desk with his hands folded. The afternoon light streaming through the window cast harsh shadows across his face. "I understand you've been spending time talking with the native workers," Morrison said without preamble. "That's not something I encourage among my men." "I was checking on the horses," Edward replied carefully. "The girl knows them well." Morrison's smile was thin and humorless. "Little Dove is Thomas Greyhorse's daughter. Thomas is a valuable worker, but his daughter has some troubling tendencies. She asks too many questions, shows too much spirit. I've been considering whether some corrective measures might be necessary." The threat hung in the air between them, like smoke. Edward felt his hands clench involuntarily as he imagined Morrison's whip falling across that small, defiant figure. "She's just a child," Edward said quietly. She's a potential problem, Morrison corrected. And problems on my ranch get dealt with before they can grow larger. I trust you understand my meaning. Edward understood perfectly. He also understood that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with Samuel Morrison and everything. The man represented. As he walked back across the yard, he caught sight of little Dove near the well, drawing water for her father's horses. She looked up and waved, and Edward felt something harden in his chest like cooling metal. The choice he'd been avoiding for weeks was no longer avoidable. In a world divided between those with power and those without, Edward Callahan was about to discover which side he truly belonged on. The first signs of trouble came on a crisp November morning when Edward arrived at the stables to find Thomas Greyhorse's hands shaking as he saddled Morrison's prize stallion. The older man's face was pale beneath his weathered skin, and when he reached for the bridle, Edward noticed fresh bruises on his wrists. What happened? Edward asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Thomas shook his head, his jaw set in a hard line. Morrison thinks someone's been stealing grain from the feed stores. He's decided to make examples until the thief comes forward. Edward's blood chilled. He'd seen Morrison's version of making examples. Who? Started with old Marcus Whitehawk yesterday. 15 strikes for being the first one to claim he knew nothing. Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. Today. It's supposed to be Sarah Crowfeather, then her son Billy tomorrow if no one confesses. The theft accusations were almost certainly fabricated, Edward realized. Morrison periodically needed to reinforce his authority through displays of violence, and missing grain provided a convenient excuse. The man had probably sold the grain himself and was now using its absence as justification for a reign of terror. And if no one confesses? Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. Thomas's eyes found his daughter across the yard, where little Dove was feeding scraps to a mangy dog that had wandered onto the ranch. He works his way through the entire community until someone breaks, or until he gets bored with the game. Edward spent the rest of the morning in a state of barely controlled fury. He'd witnessed injustice before. The frontier was full of men who used their power to exploit others, but Morrison's systematic brutality felt different. This wasn't just greed or casual cruelty. It was a calculated campaign to break the spirit of an entire community. By midday, word had spread through the ranch that Sarah Crowfeather's punishment would take place at sunset. Morrison always scheduled these events for maximum psychological impact, ensuring that his victims would spend hours contemplating their fate while the community gathered to watch. Edward found himself at the corral, where little Dove was helping her father tend to an injured colt. The girl worked with quiet efficiency, her small hands gentle as she cleaned a cut on the animal's leg. But Edward could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting toward the main house, where Morrison was undoubtedly preparing for the evening's entertainment. "Papa," little Dove said suddenly, not looking up from her work, "why don't we just leave? At night, when the guards are drunk, we could take the mountain trail to my grandmother's people." Thomas's face crumpled with pain. "You know why, little? 1. Morrison's men would hunt us down within a day. And when they brought us back, he didn't need to finish. They all knew what Morrison did to families who tried to escape. Edward had heard whispered stories of punishment so severe that strong men had died before they were complete. There has to be something, little Dove insisted, her voice rising with frustration. We can't just let him hurt people whenever he feels like it. Sometimes, Thomas said gently, survival means accepting things we cannot change. But little Dove's eyes blazed with the same defiance Edward had noticed that first day. Grandmother always said that accepting evil makes you part of it. The words hit Edward like a physical blow. He'd spent 15 years on cattle trails, witnessing countless injustices and telling himself that survival meant minding his own business. But looking at this 8-year-old girl's unwavering moral clarity, he felt the weight of every cowardly compromise he'd ever made. That evening, the entire native community was assembled in the central yard for Sarah Crowfeather's punishment. The woman was barely 25, with 2 young children who clung to her skirts as Morrison's men dragged her toward the whipping post. Her husband had died the previous winter from pneumonia, leaving her to work in Morrison's kitchens while caring for her babies alone. Morrison emerged from his house, carrying the ceremonial whip, its leather blackened with the blood of previous victims. Frank Holloway stood beside the post, ready to secure Sarah's hands above her head. The ranch hands formed a loose circle around the proceedings, some watching with obvious discomfort, others with the blank expressions of men who'd learned to shut off their consciences. "Sarah Crowfeather," Morrison announced in his booming voice, "you stand accused of theft against this ranch. The penalty is 15 strikes, to be administered immediately unless the true thief comes forward." Edward watched the faces of the native community as Morrison spoke. Terror, helplessness, and rage warred in their expressions, but no one moved. They all knew that volunteering to take Sarah's place would only result in 2 people being whipped instead of 1. As Holloway began binding Sarah's wrists, one of her children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, broke away from the crowd and ran toward his mother. "Don't hurt her," he screamed, his small fists beating ineffectively against Holloway's legs. "Please don't hurt my mama." Holloway backhanded the child casually, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The boy's sister began to cry, a heartbreaking sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Sarah herself remained silent, but Edward could see her body trembling with the effort of maintaining her composure. Morrison raised the whip, and Edward felt something snap inside his chest, like a breaking rope. "Wait," he called out, stepping forward from the circle of watchers. Every eye turned toward him. Morrison's face showed surprise that quickly transformed into suspicion. "Something to say, Callahan?" Edward's mind raced, searching for words that might diffuse the situation without signing his own death warrant. "The grain theft," he said slowly. "I might have information about that." It was a desperate gambit, and Morrison's calculating smile suggested he recognized it as such. "Information? How interesting. And what might you know about stolen grain, Cowboy?" "I've noticed some irregularities in the feed schedules," Edward replied, improvising frantically. "Certain discrepancies that might explain the shortage." Morrison's eyes narrowed. He was clearly trying to decide whether Edward was offering genuine intelligence or simply trying to delay Sarah's punishment. After a long moment, he lowered the whip slightly. "Untie her," Morrison ordered Holloway. "We'll continue this tomorrow evening after Mr. Callahan has had time to share his observations with me privately." As Sarah was released, she caught Edward's eye for just a moment. The gratitude in her gaze was overwhelming, but it was also tinged with sorrow. They both knew he'd only bought her a single day's reprieve. That night, Edward lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to honor the impossible promise he'd made. By dawn, Morrison would expect detailed information about the grain theft, and Edward had nothing to offer except lies that would quickly be exposed. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps outside the bunkhouse. Peering through the window, he saw a small figure moving across the yard toward the stables. Little Dove, apparently unable to sleep, was seeking comfort with the horses. Edward slipped out of the bunkhouse and followed her. He found the girl sitting in an empty stall, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. "Couldn't I sleep either?" he asked softly. Little Dove looked up with tear-streaked cheeks. "Tomorrow he'll hurt Sarah, and the day after that, someone else. And it will keep happening until we're all too broken to remember who we used to be." Edward settled beside her in the straw. "Your father's right, you know. Sometimes survival means accepting difficult circumstances." "No," Little Dove said fiercely. "Survival means fighting to stay human, even when monsters try to turn you into something else." The wisdom of her words shamed him. This child understood something about courage and dignity that Edward had forgotten during his years of careful neutrality. "What would you do," he asked quietly, "if you had the power to change things?" Little Dove considered the question seriously. "I'd make Morrison understand what it feels like to be helpless. I'd show him that his power comes from our fear, and what happens when that fear disappears. And if fighting back meant getting hurt, really hurt," the girl met his eyes steadily. "Getting hurt while fighting is different from getting hurt while surrendering. At least when you fight, you keep your soul." Edward felt something shift deep in his chest, like a river changing course. He'd been a drifter for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. But looking at Little Dove's fierce determination, he remembered the boy he'd once been, the one who'd believed that right and wrong mattered more than personal safety. "Your father's going to be very angry with me," Edward said finally. Little Dove tilted her head, studying his face. "Why?" "Because I'm about to do something very stupid that might get us both killed." For the first time since he'd known her, Little Dove smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her serious features. "Good," she said simply. "I was starting to think all the adults had forgotten how to be brave." Edward spent the rest of the night planning, weighing options and calculating risks. By morning, he'd settled on a course of action that was either brilliantly simple or suicidally foolish. Given his track record with bold gestures, he suspected it was probably the latter. The confrontation with Morrison was scheduled for mid-morning. In the rancher's office, Edward arrived precisely on time, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. Morrison sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence, with Holloway standing nearby like an eager executioner. "Well, Callahan," Morrison began, "I'm very curious to hear about these irregularities you mentioned." "My patience for games is somewhat limited." Edward took a deep breath. "There are no irregularities," he said clearly. "I made that up to stop you from whipping an innocent woman." The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a deep, dangerous red. Holloway's hand drifted instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "I see," Morrison said with deadly calm. "And now that you've made this confession, what exactly do you think is going to happen?" "I think," Edward replied, "that you're going to let Sarah Crowfeather go unpunished. And I think you're going to stop using those people as your personal entertainment." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "And why would I do that, Cowboy? What possible leverage do you imagine you have over me?" Edward had anticipated this question, and his answer was ready. "Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure everyone in Millbrook and every ranch from here to California knows exactly how Samuel Morrison built his fortune. About the displaced families working for slave wages, about the whippings and the terror, about everything you've done to maintain your little kingdom. It was a bluff, of course. Edward had no real connections beyond the frontier, no way to spread such stories effectively. But Morrison's initial reaction suggested the threat carried weight. The rancher's reputation was important to him, both for business and political reasons. "You're forgetting something crucial, Callahan," Morrison said after a long pause. "Dead men don't tell stories." "Maybe not," Edward agreed. "But I've already written letters to contacts in Denver and San Francisco, detailing everything I've seen here. Those letters are hidden where your men will never find them, with instructions to mail them if anything happens to me." This was a complete fabrication, but Edward delivered it with the confidence of absolute truth. Morrison studied his face intently, clearly trying to determine whether he was lying. "Even if that were true," Morrison said finally, "it changes nothing. You've admitted to interfering with ranch discipline and making false accusations against me. The penalty for that level of insubordination is the same 15 strikes you were so eager to save Sarah Crowfeather from receiving." Edward's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand, do you?" Morrison rose from his chair, moving to the window that overlooked the central yard. "Because I want to make sure you fully comprehend what you've brought upon yourself. 15 strikes with a bullwhip will flay the skin from your back. Most men don't survive the full count. Those who do carry the scars for life." "I understand," Edward repeated. Morrison turned back to face him, and Edward saw something like respect flickering in the rancher's cold eyes. "Why?" Morrison asked. "Simply, why throw your life away for people who mean nothing to you?" It was a fair question, and Edward found himself thinking about his answer. Why had he chosen this moment, this fight, to finally take a stand? Was it Little Dove's fierce courage that had shamed him into action? Sarah Crowfather's terrified children? Or was it simply that he'd finally reached the limit of his own cowardice? "Because," Edward said slowly, "a man has to draw the line somewhere, and I've decided this is where I draw mine." Morrison nodded as if this answer satisfied him completely. "Very well. The punishment will be administered at sunset, in full view of both communities. Perhaps watching you suffer will remind everyone else of the wisdom of knowing their place." As Edward was escorted from the office, he caught sight of Little Dove through the window. She was in the corral with her father, but her eyes were fixed on the main house. Even at this distance, he could see the determination in her small frame. The next few hours passed in a strange state of suspended time. Edward went through the motions of his work, checking cattle and maintaining equipment, but his mind was focused on the ordeal ahead. He'd never been whipped before, but he'd seen enough men broken by Morrison's discipline to know what awaited him. As word of the evening's punishment spread, Edward noticed the reactions of his fellow ranch hands. Some avoided his eyes, uncomfortable with his sacrifice but unwilling to risk their own positions. Others nodded with grudging respect, recognizing courage even when they couldn't understand it. But it was the response of the native community that surprised him most. Throughout the afternoon, he encountered small gestures of gratitude and support, a cup of fresh water left where he would find it, a whispered "thank you" from Sarah Crowfeather herself, meaningful looks from people who had never acknowledged his existence before. By late afternoon, the entire ranch was buzzing with anticipation. Morrison's punishments were always spectacular, designed to entertain his supporters while terrorizing his victims. But this time felt different. Edward wasn't a helpless member of the displaced community. He was one of Morrison's own men, choosing to sacrifice himself for strangers. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Edward found himself thinking about the boy he'd been in Texas, full of dreams and moral certainty. That boy would have been proud of the choice he'd made, even if it killed him. Perhaps especially if it killed him, the thought brought him an unexpected peace. For the first time in 15 years, Edward Callahan was exactly where he belonged. Sun hung low over Millbrook like a blood-red eye as the entire ranch gathered in the central yard. Edward stood near the equipment shed, his hands steady despite the hammering of his heart. Around him, Morrison's ranch hands formed their usual circle, while the native community clustered together at the far edge of the space, their faces masks of controlled anguish. Morrison emerged from his house wearing his finest clothes, a black suit with silver buttons that caught the dying light. He carried the ceremonial whip with obvious relish, letting its braided length trail behind him as he walked. Frank Holloway followed close behind, along with 2 other ranch hands who would serve as witnesses to ensure the punishment was carried out in full. "Edward Callahan," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "You have confessed to deliberate interference with ranch discipline and making false accusations against your employer. The sentence is 15 strikes, to be administered without mercy." Edward nodded once, then began removing his shirt. The evening air was cool against his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms and chest. He'd spent years working under the desert sun and his torso bore the scars of countless minor injuries, rope burns, cuts from barbed wire, the mark of a bull's horn from a drive 3 years past. Soon, those old wounds would seem insignificant as Holloway secured Edward's wrists to the wooden post. Their eyes met briefly. The foreman's expression was unreadable, but Edward thought he detected a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Any last words, Cowboy?" Morrison asked, testing the whip's weight in his hands. Edward scanned the crowd until he found little Dove standing beside her father. The girl's face was pale but determined, and when their eyes met, she gave him the slightest nod of encouragement. That small gesture filled him with more strength than he'd thought possible. "Just this," Edward said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Sometimes a man has to choose between being safe and being human. I choose human." Morrison's smile was cruel and anticipatory. Admirable sentiment. "Let's see how long it lasts." The first strike came without warning, a line of liquid fire across Edward's shoulders that drove the breath from his lungs. The sound of leather meeting flesh echoed off the surrounding buildings like a gunshot, followed immediately by the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. Edward had braced himself for pain, but the reality exceeded his worst imaginings. It felt as though someone had laid a red-hot iron bar across his back, and the burning sensation seemed to intensify rather than fade. Blood began trickling down his spine almost immediately. "One," Morrison called out with satisfaction. "The second." Strike fell lower, crossing the first to create a crude X pattern. Edward's body convulsed involuntarily, and he had to bite his tongue to keep from crying out. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. 2. By the fourth strike, Edward's vision had begun to blur. The pain was no longer confined to his back, but seemed to radiate through his entire body like poison. He could hear someone sobbing in the crowd, whether from the native community or among Morrison's own men. He couldn't tell. 5, Morrison announced cheerfully. "Not even halfway there, Cowboy. Ready to reconsider your position?" Edward forced himself to lift his head, meeting Morrison's gaze with as much defiance as he could manage. "Go to hell," he whispered. Morrison's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Oh, I do admire spirit. It makes breaking it so much more satisfying." The sixth strike opened a gash so deep that Edward felt warm blood flowing freely down his back. The seventh nearly brought him to his knees, saved only by the ropes holding him upright. By the eighth, he was no longer fully conscious, drifting in and out of awareness like a swimmer struggling against a powerful current. Somewhere in the haze of agony, Edward became aware of a commotion in the crowd. Through pain-clouded eyes, he saw little Dove breaking away from her father's restraining hands, running toward the whipping post with tears streaming down her face. "Stop it!" she screamed, throwing herself between Edward and Morrison's raised whip. "Stop hurting him!" The sight of the small girl standing protectively in front of his bloody, broken form sent a shock through the assembled watchers. Even Holloway stepped back, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. Morrison, however, seemed merely annoyed by the interruption. "Remove the child," he ordered his men. "We have 7 more strikes to complete." But as 2 ranch hands moved toward little Dove, she did something that froze everyone in place. Drawing herself up to her full height, which barely reached Edward's elbow, she fixed Morrison with a stare of absolute hatred and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of generations. "My grandmother's spirit sees you," she said in perfect English, her young voice somehow carrying the weight of ancient judgment. "She sees your black heart and the evil you've brought to her land. She says to tell you that every drop of innocent blood you spill will be returned to you threefold." The effect of her words was electric. The native community, who had been watching in horrified silence, began murmuring among themselves in their own language. Several made protective gestures, and Edward could see recognition and something approaching awe in their faces. Morrison, however, was unimpressed. Primitive superstition, he sneered. Move the child or I'll move her myself. But before anyone could act, Thomas Greyhorse stepped forward from the crowd. The stable master's face was set in lines of grim determination as he approached his. Daughter, little dove, he said gently, you must come away now. The girl turned to her father with anguish written across her features. Papa, they're killing him. He tried to save Sarah, and now they're killing him. Thomas knelt beside his daughter, placing his hands on her small shoulders. I know, little one. But this is his choice, and we must honor it. The old stories say that when someone sacrifices themselves to protect the innocent, their courage becomes part of the land forever, Little Dove said, her voice breaking. Is that true, Papa? Thomas glanced toward Edward's bloody form, then back to his daughter. Yes, he said simply. It's true. Little Dove nodded solemnly, then turned back toward Morrison. Then you haven't won anything, she told the rancher. You've only made him stronger than you'll ever be. With that, she allowed her father to lead her back to the crowd, but not before reaching out to touch Edward's hand briefly. Her small fingers were warm against his cold skin, and somehow that touch seemed to restore a measure of his fading strength. Morrison watched this exchange with growing irritation. Touching, he said sarcastically. Now, where were we? Ah yes, strike number 9. The 9th blow fell with vicious force, opening new wounds that crossed the existing pattern of cuts. Edward's body jerked against the ropes, but he managed to remain conscious. Around him, he could hear the sounds of the watching crowd, some weeping, others praying in languages he didn't understand. 10, Morrison called out. Still with us, Callahan? Good. I'd hate for you to miss the finale. The 10th strike was followed quickly by the 11th, each blow precisely calculated to maximize pain without killing outright. Morrison was an expert at this brutal art, knowing exactly how much punishment a man's body could absorb while keeping him alive to experience every moment. By the 12th strike, Edward was hanging limply from the ropes, his back a maze of crossed cuts that gleamed weightily in the fading light. Blood pooled beneath his feet, and his breathing had become shallow and irregular. Several people in the crowd had turned away, unable to watch any longer. 13, Morrison announced with obvious pleasure. Just 2 more, Cowboy. Think you can make it? Edward tried to respond, but found he had no voice left. The pain had moved beyond physical sensation into something that transcended normal human experience. He was floating somewhere above his body, watching the scene with a strange detachment. The 14th strike brought him crashing back to full awareness with a scream that tore from his throat involuntarily. The sound seemed to echo endlessly across the desert, carrying with it all the anguish and injustice he'd witnessed during his weeks at Morrison's ranch. 14, Morrison said, stepping closer to examine his handiwork. 1 more, and your little gesture of heroism will be complete. Any final thoughts? Edward raised his head with tremendous effort, his vision swimming as he tried to focus on Morrison's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but somehow everyone in the yard heard him clearly. You think this breaks something, he managed. But you're wrong. It builds something. Something you can't touch. Morrison's expression darkened. We'll see about that. The 5th, 10th, and final strike fell with all the force Morrison could muster. A blow intended not just to complete the punishment, but to break Edward's spirit entirely. The whip carved a deep furrow across his already destroyed back, and Edward's scream of agony seemed to tear a hole in the desert air. 15, Morrison announced triumphantly. Justice is served. Edward hung unconscious from the post, his body a ruin of blood and torn flesh. Several people in the crowd thought he was dead, his chest barely moved, and the amount of blood he'd lost seemed incompatible with life. But as Holloway moved to cut him down, Edward's eyes fluttered open. With tremendous effort, he lifted his head one final time and looked directly at Little Dove. Was worth it, he whispered, his words carrying across the silent yard like a benediction. The reaction to his words was immediate and profound. Among the native community, people began to weep openly, not just from sorrow, but from something deeper and more powerful. They had witnessed something that transcended mere physical courage, and they recognized it as a moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. Even among Morrison's own men, the response was telling. Several ranch hands had removed their hats and stood with bowed heads, clearly moved by Edward's sacrifice. Others stared at their employer with expressions that had shifted from respect to something closer to revulsion. Morrison himself seemed momentarily uncertain, as though Edward's final words had somehow stolen his moment of triumph. He looked around the crowd, noting the changed atmosphere, and his face darkened with frustration. "Cut him down," he ordered Holloway brusquely, "and get him out of my sight." As Edward was lowered from the post, his legs gave out entirely. Two ranch hands caught him under the arms, supporting his weight as his head lolled forward. Blood continued to drip steadily from his wounds, forming a trail across the yard. "Take him to the old storage shed behind the blacksmith shop," Morrison commanded. "If he survives the night, he can leave in the morning. If not, ... He shrugged eloquently, but Thomas Greyhorse stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face set with determination. "No," he said quietly. "We'll care for him." Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "He's not your responsibility, Thomas. He chose this path." "He chose it to protect one of us," Thomas replied steadily. "That makes him family." The simple statement carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire crowd. Morrison looked as though he might object, but something in Thomas's manner, or perhaps the supportive murmurs from both communities, made him reconsider. "Very well," Morrison said with obvious reluctance. "But I want him off my property by sunrise, alive or dead." Thomas nodded once, then moved to help support Edward's weight. Little Dove appeared at her father's side, her small face streaked with tears but set with fierce determination. "Can we save him, Papa?" she whispered. Thomas looked down at Edward's ravaged back, calculating blood loss and trauma with the practical eye of someone who'd seen violence before. "I don't know, little one, but we're going to try." As they helped carry Edward toward the native settlement, Little Dove reached out to touch his hand once more. This time, his fingers closed weakly around hers, and she felt a surge of hope. "You're going to be all right," she told him with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "My grandmother's spirit is with you now. She won't let you die." Edward's eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on her young face with tremendous effort. "Little Dove," he whispered. Still brave, always," she replied firmly. "Just like you taught me." As the procession moved across the yard toward the settlement, Morrison watched from his porch with conflicted emotions. He'd gotten what he wanted, a brutal demonstration of his power that would cow both communities into submission. But somehow the victory felt hollow, tainted by the unexpected dignity Edward had shown in defeat. Behind him, Frank Holloway cleared his throat uncertainly. "Boss, the men are asking questions. Some of them are saying maybe we went too far." Morrison turned to face his foreman, and Holloway was startled by the uncertainty he saw in the rancher's eyes. For just a moment, the mask of absolute authority had slipped, revealing something that looked almost like doubt. 15 strikes is the standard punishment for insubordination," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Callahan knew the consequences of his actions. "Yes, sir," Holloway replied carefully, but the way he took it, what he said. "Some of the boys are calling it the bravest thing they ever saw." Morrison's face hardened again. Bravery and stupidity often look the same until you see the results. We'll know which this was by morning. But as he watched the small procession disappear into the native settlement, Morrison found himself wondering whether Edward Callahan's 15 strikes might have accomplished something that 15 years of fear and brutality could not. The sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of purple and gold. In the native settlement, oil lamps flickered to life as the community gathered to tend to the cowboy, who had sacrificed everything for one of their own. The real question was whether Edward's courage would prove to be the spark that finally ignited a fire Morrison couldn't control. The native settlement transformed into a place of quiet urgency as word spread about Edward's condition. Women emerged from their modest dwellings carrying strips of clean cloth, bowls of water, and precious bottles of healing remedies passed down through generations. Men who had worked Morrison's cattle all day without rest now moved with renewed purpose, creating a space where the wounded cowboy could fight for his life. Thomas Greyhorse directed Edward's care with the same methodical precision he brought to managing Morrison's stables. The community's healer, an elderly woman named Elena Morningstar, examined Edward's wounds with gentle but thorough hands while murmuring prayers in the ancient language of her people. "The bleeding must be stopped first," Elena announced her, weathered fingers tracing the deepest cuts across Edward's back. "Then we clean the wounds and bind them properly. But ... She paused, meeting Thomas's worried gaze. "He has lost much blood. Whether he lives depends on his will to fight." Little Dove knelt beside the makeshift bed they'd created from blankets and horse blankets, her small hand resting lightly on Edward's arm. His skin was pale and cold to the touch, his breathing so shallow that she had to watch carefully to see his chest rise and fall. "He's still fighting," she said with quiet certainty. "I can feel it." Elena smiled at the girl's fierce determination. "Then we must give him every reason to keep fighting." The healing process began with ancient remedies that had sustained the Tohono O'odham people for countless generations. Elena prepared poultices from desert plants, the anti-inflammatory properties of creosote bush, the infection-fighting compounds found in chaparral, and the pain-relieving qualities of desert willow bark. These treatments, combined with careful cleaning and precise bandaging, represented medical knowledge that predated Morrison's ranch by centuries. As Elena worked, other members of the community gathered outside the small dwelling where Edward lay. They came not as curious onlookers, but as people united by witnessing something that had fundamentally changed their understanding of what was possible. Sarah Crowfeather was among the first to arrive, bringing soup made from precious vegetables she'd been saving for her children's meals. "He saved me from those 15 strikes," she told Thomas quietly. "The least I can do is help him heal from the ones he took in my place." Others followed with their own offerings. Joseph Redhawk, the young man who had been whipped weeks earlier, brought a hand-carved wooden cup filled with clean water. Marcus Whitehawk, despite his own recent injuries, offered strips of soft leather that could be used for bandages. Each gift represented a sacrifice from people who had almost nothing, but who understood the sacred nature of honoring courage. Throughout the long night, members of the community took turns sitting vigil beside Edward's bed. They spoke to him in whispered voices, sharing stories of their ancestors' bravery, of times when their people had faced impossible odds and found the strength to endure. Whether Edward could hear them in his unconscious state didn't matter. The stories were as much for the storytellers as for their intended audience. Little Dove rarely left Edward's side, maintaining a watch that impressed even the adults. She talked to him constantly, describing the stars visible through the small window, recounting memories of her mother that her father had shared, and making plans for all the things she would show him when he recovered. "My grandmother used to say that courage is like a fire," she told him during the darkest hours before dawn. "Once it's lit, it spreads to everyone around it. You lit that fire tonight, Edward. Now it's burning in all of us." Meanwhile, in the main ranch house, Samuel Morrison was discovering that victory could be more complicated than he'd anticipated. The brutal efficiency of Edward's punishment had indeed cowed his workforce into submission, but it had also created an atmosphere of tension that he hadn't expected. Several of his longtime ranch hands had approached Frank Holloway with concerns about the severity of the whipping. These weren't soft-hearted newcomers questioning ranch discipline. They were hardened men who'd worked cattle drives and frontier ranches for decades. Their discomfort with what they'd witnessed spoke to something deeper than squeamishness. The Dundee boys are saying it went too far, Holloway reported during a late-night conversation in Morrison's study. 15 strikes for trying to protect a woman and her kids. Some of them are calling it excessive. Morrison poured himself another whiskey, his third since the punishment had ended. Callahan knew the consequences when he chose to interfere. I didn't create those consequences, I simply enforced them. Maybe so, Holloway replied carefully. But the way he took it, the things he said, it's got people thinking. About right and wrong, about what kind of men they want to be. The foreman's words carried a warning that Morrison was beginning to understand. Fear was an effective tool for maintaining control, but only as long as people felt they had something to lose. Edward's willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers had demonstrated a different kind of power, one that Morrison's brutality couldn't touch. What are you suggesting, Frank? Morrison asked, though. He suspected he already knew the answer. Maybe it's time to ease up a bit. Give people some breathing room. Show a little mercy. The native workers are already broken. We don't need to keep breaking them. Morrison considered this advice while staring out the window toward the settlement, where Edward fought for his life. The rancher had built his empire on the principle that absolute control required absolute willingness to use violence. But Edward's defiance had introduced a variable that didn't fit the equation. As dawn approached, word began filtering back to the main ranch about Edward's condition. The native workers who reported for their morning duties carried with them updates on his progress. The bleeding had been stopped. The fever was manageable. His breathing had grown stronger during the night. More importantly, they carried themselves differently. The defeated posture that had characterized the community for months had been replaced by something Morrison recognized and feared. Hope. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Workers met his eyes directly instead of staring at the ground. Conversations didn't immediately cease when he approached. The atmosphere of constant terror that had been his primary tool of control was evaporating like morning mist. By mid-morning, Morrison knew he had to act. Edward's survival was becoming a symbol of resistance that threatened everything he'd built. The cowboy had to be removed from the ranch immediately, before his continued presence could inspire further acts of defiance. Morrison found Thomas Greyhorse in the main stable, tending to a mare that had thrown a shoe. The stable master looked up as his employer approached, and Morrison was struck by the change in the man's demeanor. The deference that had characterized their interactions for years had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like dignity. I want Callahan gone, Morrison said without preamble. Today, whether he can ride or not. Thomas straightened slowly, setting down his tools with deliberate care. He's not strong enough to travel. Moving him now could kill him. That's not my concern, Morrison replied coldly. He chose to defy me, and now he lives with the consequences. I want him off my property before sunset. Thomas studied Morrison's face for a long moment, and the rancher found himself uncomfortable under that steady gaze. There was something in the stable master's eyes that suggested the balance of power between them had shifted in ways Morrison was only beginning to understand. And if I refuse? Thomas asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Morrison had never had an employee, particularly a native employee, speak to him with such direct defiance. His hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip, but Thomas didn't flinch. Then you'll join him in exile, Morrison said, his voice carrying a threat that both men understood. Along with anyone else who thinks they can defy my orders. Thomas nodded slowly, as though Morrison's response had confirmed something he'd already suspected. I see. And my daughter? Little. Dove can stay if she learns to mind her place. But you and Callahan leave together, or you both die together. Your choice. The stable master considered this ultimatum with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. Morrison expected immediate submission. After all, Thomas had a child to consider, responsibilities that should have made defiance impossible. Instead, Thomas smiled. It was a small expression, barely perceptible, but it carried with it a weight of certainty that made Morrison's blood run cold. You know what your problem is, Morrison? Thomas said conversationally. You think power comes from making people afraid. But real power, the kind that lasts, comes from making people willing to follow you. Edward showed us the difference last night. Morrison's face darkened with rage. Callahan showed you how to get yourself killed for nothing. He accomplished nothing except getting his back torn to pieces. Did he? Thomas asked. Look around, Morrison. Really look. Do you see the same broken people who were here yesterday? Do you feel the same fear that's kept us in line for all these months? Morrison did look, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The native workers going about their morning tasks moved with purpose rather than resignation. They spoke to each other in normal voices instead of frightened whispers. Most disturbing of all, they looked at him directly when he passed, without the automatic deference he'd come to expect. Edward didn't just take those 15 strikes, Thomas continued. He transformed them into something you can't control. He turned your weapon against you, Morrison. And now we all know it's possible to stand up to you and survive. The rancher's hand tightened on his gun grip. You're forgetting who has the real power here, Thomas. I can have you all shot down like dogs, and no one would question it. You could, Thomas agreed calmly. But then you'd have no workers, no one to run your cattle or maintain your property. And word would spread to every ranch from here to California about the man who slaughtered an entire community because one cowboy showed them how to be brave. Morrison realized he was trapped in a situation that his usual methods couldn't resolve. Violence had always been his solution to problems, but Thomas was right. Mass murder would destroy everything he'd built. Yet allowing this defiance to stand would undermine his authority just as completely. What do you want? Morrison asked through gritted teeth. Thomas's smile widened slightly. Fair wages for fair work, decent living conditions, an end to the whippings and the terror, the right to leave if we choose, without being hunted down like animals. And in return, we continue to work your ranch, tend your cattle, maintain your property. But as employees, not slaves. As human beings who deserve basic dignity. Morrison stared at the stable master with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. In less than 12 hours, Edward Callahan's sacrifice had accomplished what years of complaints and pleas had failed to achieve. The cowboy had given the community something they'd lost, the courage to demand better treatment. I need time to consider your terms, Morrison said finally. Thomas shook his head. You have until Edward is strong enough to travel. When he leaves, we all leave unless you agree to treat us with the respect we deserve. The ultimatum was delivered with quiet certainty, and Morrison understood that Thomas meant every word. The stable master had found his own courage in Edward's example, and that courage was already spreading to others. As Morrison walked back toward his house, he caught sight of little Dove in the settlement, carrying water to the dwelling where Edward was recovering. The girl moved with the same determined grace that had marked her intervention the night before, and Morrison realized that she too had been transformed by what she'd witnessed. The rancher had always prided himself on understanding human nature, on knowing exactly how much pressure it took to break someone's spirit. But Edward Callahan had revealed a flaw in that understanding. Some spirits grew stronger when tested, and their strength could inspire others to find courage they never knew they possessed. Back in the settlement, Edward was beginning to show Signs of improvement. His fever had broken during the morning hours, and Elena's careful ministrations had prevented infection from setting in. The bleeding had stopped completely, and while his back would bear the scars of Morrison's whip for the rest of his life, it appeared he would indeed have a rest of his life to bear them. Little Dove was the first to notice when Edward's eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort on her concerned face. "Welcome back," she said softly. "We were starting to worry you might sleep through the revolution." Edward tried to speak but found his throat too dry to form words. Little Dove helped him sip water from the wooden cup Joseph Redhawk had carved, and gradually he was able to whisper a response. "Revolution?" he asked. Little Dove's grin was radiant. "My father told Morrison that things are going to change around here. No more whippings, no more slave wages, no more treating us like animals. Morrison has until you're strong enough to travel to decide whether he agrees." Edward closed his eyes, absorbing the implications of what she'd told him. His sacrifice had been intended to save one woman from 15 strikes, nothing more. The idea that it might have catalyzed broader change seemed almost too good to believe. "And if Morrison refuses?" he asked. "Then we all leave together," Little Dove replied matter-of-factly. "All of us, the entire community. Papa says you showed us that it's better to face uncertainty as free people than to accept certainty as slaves." Edward felt tears stinging his eyes, not from pain, but from an overwhelming sense that his suffering had meaning beyond what he'd dared to hope. 15 strikes had indeed transformed something, but not in the way Morrison intended. As news of Edward's awakening spread through the settlement, people began gathering outside the small dwelling to offer their own words of gratitude and support. They came in small groups, speaking quietly, but with voices that carried new strength and determination. The revolution Little Dove had mentioned was indeed underway, and it had been born from the simple recognition that courage, once displayed, could not be unseen or forgotten. The question now was whether Samuel Morrison would choose to evolve with his changing world, or whether he would fight to preserve a system of control that Edward Callahan's 15 strikes had already begun to destroy. 3 days after Edward's whipping, Samuel Morrison discovered that controlling a workforce was vastly different from terrorizing one. The subtle but unmistakable changes in his ranch's daily operations began as minor irritations but quickly escalated into significant challenges to his authority. The native workers still reported for their assigned duties, but they no longer performed them with the desperate efficiency of people afraid for their lives. Cattle were tended adequately rather than meticulously. Repairs were completed on schedule, but without the extra attention to detail that fear had previously motivated. Most troubling of all, the workers had begun to coordinate their efforts in ways that suggested organized resistance rather than individual compliance. Morrison first noticed the change during his morning inspection of the horse corrals. Normally, the sight of his approaching figure would trigger a flurry of activity as workers scrambled to appear busy and productive. Instead, he found the native employees going about their tasks with calm professionalism, acknowledging his presence with polite nods rather than the submissive deference he'd come to expect. Thomas Greyhorse stood near the main stable, supervising the grooming of Morrison's prize stallion. The stable master's posture was relaxed, confident, and when he looked up at Morrison's approach, his eyes held none of the wariness that had characterized their interactions for months. "Morning, Morrison," Thomas said, his tone neutral but notably lacking the deferential "sir" that had always preceded their conversations. Morrison felt his jaw tighten at the subtle insubordination. "How's the stallion's leg?" he asked, referring to a minor injury the horse had sustained 2 days earlier. "Healing well. Elena prepared a poultice that's reducing the swelling. He should be ready for riding by week's end." The casual mention of Elena Morningstar, the community's traditional healer, treating one of Morrison's valuable horses, represented another small but significant shift. Previously, any medical care for ranch animals had been handled exclusively by Morrison's approved methods. Now, Thomas was making treatment decisions independently and reporting them as accomplished facts rather than seeking permission. "I don't recall authorizing the use of native remedies on my livestock," Morrison said coldly. Thomas paused in his work, meeting Morrison's gaze steadily. "You didn't forbid it either. Elena's knowledge of healing has kept our people healthy for generations. Seems foolish not to use that knowledge when it can help." The response was perfectly reasonable, which made Morrison's anger all the more difficult to justify. Thomas wasn't being openly defiant, merely practical. But the underlying message was clear. The community would no longer automatically defer to Morrison's preferences when their own knowledge and experience offered better solutions. Similar small rebellions were occurring throughout the ranch. Sarah Crowfeather had reorganized the kitchen work schedule to be more efficient, implementing changes without seeking Morrison's approval. Joseph Redhawk had begun training younger workers in cattle handling techniques, creating an informal education system that operated independently of ranch oversight. Marcus Whitehawk was teaching other workers to read and write during their evening hours, activities that Morrison had previously discouraged. Each individual action was minor, even beneficial to ranch operations. Collectively, they represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamic that had governed Morrison's empire for years. Frank Holloway brought these concerns to Morrison during their evening meeting in the ranch house study. The foreman's usually confident demeanor showed signs of strain as he reported on the day's developments. "It's like they're not afraid anymore," Holloway said, pouring himself a whiskey without waiting for permission. "They're still working, still following orders, but there's something different. They're acting like employees instead of property." Morrison nodded grimly. He'd reached the same conclusion during his own observations. "What about the other ranch hands? How are they responding to these changes?" Holloway's expression grew troubled. "That's part of the problem. Some of the boys are starting to say the native workers have the right idea. They're asking questions about their own wages, their working conditions, whether they should have more say in how things are run." This development was even more concerning than the native community's organized resistance. Morrison's own hired men were beginning to question the very foundation of his authority, inspired by the courage they'd witnessed during Edward's punishment. "Any talk of leaving?" Morrison asked. "Some. Bill Crawford and Jake Martinez are already planning to head north when their contracts expire next month. They say they want to work for outfits that treat men like men, not like livestock." Morrison felt the walls of his carefully constructed kingdom beginning to crack. The economic foundation of his ranch depended on maintaining a workforce that accepted low wages and harsh conditions because they believed they had no alternatives. If that belief evaporated, his entire business model would collapse. "What about Callahan? How's he recovering?" Holloway shifted uncomfortably. "According to the reports I'm getting, he's healing faster than anyone expected. Elena's treatments are working better than conventional medicine might have. He's awake most of the time now, talking with visitors, even sitting up for short periods." Morrison absorbed this information with growing frustration. Edward's survival was becoming a powerful symbol of resistance, proof that Morrison's punishments weren't the death sentences they'd appeared to be. Every day the cowboy remained alive strengthened the community's belief that their employer could be challenged and defeated. "I want to see him," Morrison announced suddenly. Holloway's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sir?" "Callahan. I want to talk to him personally. Tomorrow morning." The foreman looked uncertain. "The native workers might not appreciate you visiting their settlement, especially given the circumstances." Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "They can appreciate it or not, as they choose. But they'll permit it, because they know I still hold the real power here. And maybe it's time to remind Callahan of that fact as well." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with desert winds carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Morrison, dressed carefully for his visit to the native settlement, choosing clothes that projected authority without appearing overly formal. He wanted to convey strength and confidence, not the desperation he actually felt. Thomas Greyhorse was waiting for him at the settlement's edge, flanked by several other community leaders. Their positioning was clearly intentional, a peaceful but unmistakable assertion that Morrison would enter their space on their terms. "We agreed you could visit Edward," Thomas said without preamble. "But this is our home, Morrison. You'll show respect while you're here." The stable master's tone was polite but firm, establishing boundaries that Morrison had never encountered before. The rancher felt his anger rising but forced himself to nod agreement. He needed this conversation with Edward more than he needed to assert dominance over Thomas. The dwelling where Edward was recovering stood at the heart of the settlement, surrounded by the small homes and workshops that housed the community. As Morrison walked through the narrow paths between buildings, he noticed details that had escaped his attention during previous visits. Gardens flourished behind many homes, carefully tended plots that produced vegetables and medicinal plants. Children played between the dwellings, their laughter carrying clearly in the morning air. Women worked at looms and pottery wheels, creating items of surprising beauty and complexity. This wasn't the collection of broken refugees Morrison had always imagined. It was a functioning community with its own culture and economy. Edward lay propped against several pillows in a bed positioned near the dwelling's single window. Morning light illuminated his face, which showed the pallor of recent trauma, but also the clear eyes of someone whose fever had broken. His back was heavily bandaged, but he sat upright without apparent distress. Little Dove sat beside the bed, reading aloud from a book that Morrison recognized as one of his own apparently. Someone had borrowed it from the ranch house library. The girl looked up as Morrison entered, her expression wary but unafraid. "Hello, Morrison," Edward said, his voice weak but steady. "Come to finish the job?" Morrison studied the cowboy's face, searching for signs of the broken spirit he'd expected to find. Instead, he saw something that looked suspiciously like peace, the expression of a man who had found meaning in his suffering. "I came to see how you were healing," Morrison replied, "and to discuss your future." Edward's smile was thin but genuine. "My future's pretty simple. As soon as I'm strong enough to ride, I'll be leaving your ranch. The question is whether I'll be leaving alone." "That depends on you," Morrison said, settling into a chair that had been positioned nearby. "I'm prepared to offer you a proposition." Little Dove started to speak, but Edward gestured for her to remain silent. The cowboy's eyes never left Morrison's face as he waited to hear the rancher's offer. "You've caused considerable disruption to my operations," Morrison began. "The workers are restless, productivity is declining, and my authority has been undermined. But I'm a practical man, Callahan. I recognize talent when I see it." Edward raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I want you to stay," Morrison continued. "Not as a ranch hand, but as my partner. Full shares in the operation, equal say in all decisions, your own house and land. In return, you help me restore order and get these people back to work." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Morrison watched Edward's face carefully, looking for signs that the proposition might be tempting. Financial security, social status, and freedom from the hard life of a drifting cowboy. These were powerful incentives for a man who had never owned anything more valuable than his horse and saddle. Edward was quiet for so long that Morrison began to hope his gamble might succeed. If he could co-opt the source of the community's newfound courage, the resistance movement would collapse on itself. "That's a generous offer," Edward said finally. "More generous than I deserve." Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction. "Then you'll accept?" Edward's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made Morrison's confidence waver. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this is about money, or status, or personal comfort. You think you can buy courage the same way you buy cattle. The cowboy's voice grew stronger as he continued. What happened 3 nights ago wasn't about me, Morrison. It was about recognizing that some things matter more than survival. These people don't need me to tell them how to be brave. They just needed someone to show them it was possible. Morrison felt his offer crumbling before it was fully rejected. Without leadership, their resistance will fall apart. They'll go back to being grateful for whatever scraps I choose to give them. Will they? Edward asked. Look around, Morrison. Really look. Do you see grateful slaves, or do you see people who've remembered their own worth? Through the window, Morrison could indeed see members of the community going about their daily tasks. But their movements had a quality he'd never noticed before: purposefulness, dignity, and something that looked like hope. These weren't the defeated refugees he'd grown accustomed to controlling. Besides, Edward continued, you're assuming I'm the leader of this movement. But leadership doesn't always come from the person who takes the biggest risk. Sometimes it comes from the person who shows the most wisdom. Morrison followed Edward's gaze to Little Dove, who had been listening to their conversation with intense concentration. The girl's young face showed an understanding that seemed far beyond her years, and when she looked at Morrison, he saw the same unwavering moral certainty that had marked her intervention during the whipping. She's 8 years old, Morrison protested. Age doesn't determine wisdom, Edward replied. Little Dove understood something about courage and justice before I ever arrived here. I just gave her permission to act on that understanding. Little Dove spoke for the first time since Morrison's arrival, her young voice carrying surprising authority. My grandmother used to say that when people stop being afraid, they start being free. You built your power on our fear, Morrison. But fear is like a dam. Eventually, the water finds a way around it. Morrison stared at the child, recognizing the same fierce intelligence that had marked her father. But where Thomas's wisdom was tempered by years of compromise and survival, Little Dove's understanding was pure and uncompromising. What do you want? Morrison asked, addressing the question to Edward but keeping his eyes on Little Dove. We want what Thomas already told you, Edward replied. Fair wages, decent treatment, and the right to leave if we choose. Nothing more complicated than basic human dignity. Morrison felt trapped between impossible choices. Accepting the community's demands would represent a fundamental admission that his previous methods had been wrong, undermining his authority with every other ranch in the territory. But refusing would likely result in losing his entire workforce, leaving him with thousands of cattle and no one to tend them. I need time to consider, he said finally. Edward nodded. Time's something I've got plenty of now. But don't take too long, Morrison. Every day you delay, more people realize they don't have to live the way you've been forcing them to live. As Morrison prepared to leave, Little Dove rose from her chair beside Edward's bed. Morrison, she said, her voice stopping him at the doorway. There's something else my grandmother used to say. The rancher turned back, despite himself curious about what other wisdom this remarkable child might share. She said that the strongest trees are the ones that learn to bend with the wind. The ones that stay rigid get broken by the first big storm. Morrison studied her face, seeing in her young features the echo of generations of wisdom and resilience. For just a moment, he wondered what kind of ranch, what kind of community might be possible if he chose to bend rather than break. But the moment passed, replaced by the familiar anger that had driven him for so many years. He left the settlement without another word, his mind already turning to other solutions, other ways to maintain control without surrendering the power that defined his identity. Behind him, Edward and Little Dove watched through the window as he walked back toward the main ranch buildings. Neither spoke, but both understood that the conversation had settled nothing and changed everything. The storm Little Dove had referenced was indeed coming, and Samuel Morrison would soon discover whether his empire was strong enough to survive. The morning after Morrison's failed negotiation with Edward, Frank Holloway arrived at the ranch house to find his employer standing at the window of his study. staring out at the native settlement with the intensity of a man contemplating war. Empty whiskey bottles littered the desk behind him, evidence of a sleepless night spent wrestling with choices that all led to unacceptable outcomes. "Any orders for today, boss?" Holloway asked, though the careful neutrality in his voice suggested. He already sensed the direction of Morrison's thoughts. Morrison turned from the window, and Holloway was startled by the change in his employer's appearance. The rancher's usually immaculate clothing was wrinkled and stained, his silver hair disheveled, and his eyes held a desperate edge that spoke of a man who had exhausted all reasonable options. "How many men do we have who are still completely loyal?" Morrison asked without preamble. Holloway felt his stomach tighten. He'd been with Morrison long enough to recognize the tone that preceded violence. "Depends on what you mean by loyalty and what you're planning to ask them to do. I mean men who understand that sometimes harsh measures are necessary to maintain order. Men who won't hesitate when given difficult instructions." The foreman considered the question carefully. Over the past week, several ranch hands had expressed doubts about Morrison's methods, particularly after witnessing Edward's whipping. Others had grown uncomfortable with the increasingly tense atmosphere on the ranch. But some remained committed to the old ways, either through genuine loyalty or simple fear of change. "Maybe 8 or 10, Holloway answered honestly. "But boss, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, it's a mistake, a big one." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Everything I've tried has been a mistake, Frank. Trying to reason with them, offering compromises, attempting to buy their cooperation, all mistakes. Sometimes the only language people understand is force. These aren't raiders or rustlers," Holloway protested. "They're families, women and children. Our own workers." "They're the source of a cancer that's spreading through my ranch," Morrison corrected coldly. "And cancer gets cut out before it can metastasize." Holloway had served under hard men before, but the casual way Morrison discussed violence against defenseless people chilled him to the bone. "What exactly are you ordering me to do?" Morrison moved to his desk, pulling out a detailed map of the ranch property. His finger traced the boundaries of the native settlement, marking entrances and escape routes with the precision of a military strategist. "Tonight, after the evening meal when everyone's settled in their homes, we're going to end this rebellion once and for all. A show of force that will remind everyone why my authority isn't negotiable. And if they resist?" Morrison's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Then we make examples of the resistors and see how eager the survivors are to continue their rebellion." Holloway stared at his employer, seeing clearly for the first time the monster that had always lurked beneath Morrison's veneer of civilization. "I won't be part of a massacre." "Then you're fired," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Clean out your bunk and be off my property within the hour. And Frank, if you're thinking about warning anyone, remember that you've been my foreman for 8 years. If questions get asked about what's happened here, you'll be just as responsible as I am." The threat hung between them like a blade. Holloway understood that Morrison was past the point of rational calculation, driven by desperation and rage into actions that would destroy everything he claimed to be protecting. But the foreman also knew that any attempt to warn the native community would likely result in his own death. After a long moment, Holloway nodded slowly. "I'll gather the men you want and brief them on the plan. But Morrison, when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, don't expect me to help you clean up the mess." "It won't go wrong," Morrison said with absolute certainty. "By tomorrow morning, order will be restored, and everyone on this ranch will remember why crossing Samuel Morrison is a fatal mistake." As Holloway left to make the preparations, Morrison returned to his window overlooking the settlement. From this distance, he could see children playing between the homes, women tending gardens, men working on various projects. To an outside observer, it would look like a peaceful community going about its daily business. But Morrison saw something else, a collection of people who had forgotten their place in the natural order of things. People who needed to be reminded that power flowed from the barrel of a gun, not from noble gestures or pretty speeches about dignity and courage. Meanwhile, in the settlement itself, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism mixed with underlying tension. Word had spread about Morrison's visit to Edward, and while the rancher's offer had been rejected, many saw it as evidence that their position was stronger than they dared to hope. Thomas Greyhorse was less optimistic. He'd known Morrison for years, had watched the man's reactions to challenges and setbacks. The stable master recognized the signs of a cornered predator, and he understood that desperate men often chose violence when subtlety failed. "We need to be prepared for trouble," Thomas told the gathered community leaders during an afternoon meeting in Elena Morningstar's home. "Morrison isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully." "What kind of trouble?" asked Sarah Crawfeather, bouncing her youngest child on her knee while keeping one eye on her older son playing outside. "The violent kind," Thomas replied grimly. "Morrison built his power on fear and brutality. When those tools stop working, he'll use more of them, not less." Joseph Redhawk, still bearing the scars from his own encounter with Morrison's justice, leaned forward intently. "Are you saying he might attack us directly, here in the settlement?" "I'm saying we'd be foolish not to prepare for that possibility." Elena Morningstar spoke from her position near the window, where she'd been watching the main ranch buildings through the afternoon heat shimmer. "My grandmother lived through the worst of the Apache Wars. She always said that when cornered animals get desperate, they become most dangerous to everything around them." The weight of this wisdom settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They'd come so far in the past week, found so much courage and hope. The thought that Morrison might respond with overwhelming violence was almost too painful to contemplate. "What do we do?" Sarah asked quietly. Thomas considered the question carefully. They had few options. The settlement was surrounded by Morrisons. Land with limited escape routes and no real defensive positions. Most of the men were workers, not fighters, and the community included too many women and children to consider armed resistance. "We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best," he said finally. "Tonight, we post guards around the settlement. Anyone who can't fight gets ready to run, if necessary. And we pray that Morrison chooses wisdom over vengeance." As the meeting dispersed, Thomas made his way to the dwelling where Edward was recovering. The cowboy was sitting up in bed, carefully stretching his healing back muscles under Elena's watchful supervision. His color had improved dramatically over the past few days, and the worst of his wounds were beginning to close. "Feeling stronger?" Thomas asked. Edward nodded, though the movement clearly caused him discomfort. "Strong enough to ride if I have to." "Why? Are we expecting trouble?" Thomas briefly explained his concerns about Morrison's potential response to their resistance. Edward listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the implications became clear. "He's not going to accept defeat," Edward agreed. "Men like Morrison would rather burn everything down than admit they were wrong." "Can you travel if we need to evacuate?" Edward tested his range of motion carefully, wincing as scar tissue pulled against healing flesh. "I can manage. Won't be comfortable, but I can stay in the saddle if necessary." Little Dove, who had been listening from her usual spot beside Edward's bed, spoke up with the directness that had become her trademark. "Running away won't solve anything. Morrison will just hunt us down, and then we'll be scattered and helpless instead of together and strong." Both men looked at the 8-year-old girl, struck once again by the wisdom that seemed to flow from her naturally. She was right. Of course, fleeing would only delay the confrontation while weakening their position. "What do you suggest?" Thomas asked his daughter seriously. Little Dove's answer came without hesitation. "We stay and face him. All of us together. If Morrison wants to destroy our community, he'll have to do it in front of everyone, where the whole world can see what kind of man he really is." Edward felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his injuries. The girl's strategy was sound but terrifying, forcing Morrison to reveal his true nature through public action, making it impossible for him to maintain the fiction of justified authority. "That's a dangerous gamble," Thomas said softly. "If Morrison's truly lost his reason, he might not care who witnesses his actions." "Then we make sure the right people are watching," Little Dove replied. "Send riders to the other ranches, to the town, to anyone who might care about justice. Make Morrison choose between backing down and revealing himself as a monster in front of everyone." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity, but it required a level of coordination and courage that would test the community's newfound resolve. They would essentially be betting their lives that Morrison retained enough sanity to avoid actions that would destroy his reputation along with their settlement. "It could work," Edward said slowly, "but we'd need to move fast. If Morrison's planning something for tonight, we have only a few hours to get word out." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll send Joseph and 2 others to the neighboring ranches. Sarah can take a message to town. She knows people there who might listen. But this is asking a lot of people who have their own families to think about." "Sometimes," Little Dove said with the quiet certainty that had become her signature, "asking a lot is the only way to get what you need." As preparations began for what might be their final stand, Edward found himself marveling at the transformation that had taken place over the past week. A community that had been broken and hopeless had rediscovered its strength and dignity. People who had accepted brutality as inevitable were now willing to risk everything for the chance to live as free human beings. His 15 strikes had indeed changed something fundamental, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. Instead of creating martyrdom or inspiring revenge, his sacrifice had revealed the power that lay dormant within an entire community. Now that power would be tested in ways that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the kind of future they might dare to hope for. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, riders departed from the settlement carrying messages that would either bring help or serve as final testimonies to their courage. The community that remained behind settled in to wait, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether Samuel Morrison's empire would evolve or collapse entirely. In his ranch house study, Morrison completed his own preparations, cleaning weapons and reviewing maps with the cold efficiency of a man who had moved beyond moral considerations. He was confident that superior firepower and surprise would carry the day, restoring his authority through the oldest and most reliable method known to mankind. Neither side fully understood that they were about to participate in something larger than a simple confrontation between employer and employees. They were creating a moment that would echo through the territory's history, a test of whether courage and community could triumph over power and violence. The stage was set for a conflict that would prove, once and for all, whether Edward Callahan's 15 strikes had truly changed the world, or merely delayed its inevitable crushing of hope. The first signs that Little Dove's desperate gamble might succeed came just as the sun touched the western mountains. Dust clouds on the horizon announced the arrival of riders from 3 different directions, and the lookouts Thomas had posted around the settlement called out confirmations that help was indeed coming. Robert Hensley, owner of the Circle Bar Ranch 15 miles north, arrived first with 2 of his foremen. Hensley was a weathered man in his 60s who had built his reputation on fair dealing and honest work. His presence at Morrison's ranch represented significant validation of the community's claims about their treatment. "Joseph Redhawk came to my place with some serious accusations," Hensley told Thomas as he dismounted near the settlement's edge. "Said Morrison was planning violence against your people tonight. That true?" Thomas nodded grimly. "We have good reason to believe so. Morrison's been losing control over the past week, and desperate men do desperate things." Hensley studied the settlement with experienced eyes, taking in the defensive preparations and the obvious tension among its inhabitants. Where's this cowboy I've been hearing about? The one who took 15 strikes to protect a woman. Recovering from those strikes, Thomas replied. But he's the reason we finally found the courage to stand up for ourselves. Before Hensley could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of more visitors. Sheriff William Porter rode into view accompanied by Mayor Charles Whitman from Millbrook, along with 3 deputies and several prominent citizens. The sheriff's presence transformed the situation immediately, whatever Morrison might have planned for a nighttime raid against defenseless workers. He wouldn't dare attack in front of law enforcement and town officials. Sheriff Porter was a lean man with graying hair and the steady demeanor of someone who had spent years navigating the complex politics of frontier justice. He'd heard enough stories about Morrison's methods to have concerns, but he'd never had sufficient evidence or witnesses willing to testify to take action. "Mr. Greyhorse," Porter said, dismounting and approaching Thomas with professional courtesy, "I received some disturbing reports about conditions here at the Morrison Ranch. Would you be willing to share your perspective on recent events?" Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. The sheriff's presence offered protection, but it also represented a test of whether their grievances would be taken seriously by the broader community. "Sheriff, we've been trying to work out our differences with Morrison directly, but the situation has become dangerous. We have reason to believe he's planning to use violence against our families tonight." Porter's expression grew serious. "What kind of violence?" Before Thomas could answer, another group of riders appeared on the horizon. These weren't neighbors or town officials. They were journalists from territorial newspapers, drawn by reports of conflict and potential scandal. Little Dove's strategy of publicity was working even better than she'd hoped. Morrison, watching these developments from his ranch house window, felt his carefully planned operation crumbling before it could begin. The arrival of witnesses, particularly law enforcement and journalists, made his intended raid impossible. But rather than feeling relief at avoiding a potentially disastrous confrontation, the rancher's rage only intensified. "Boss," one of his remaining loyal men said, entering the study where Morrison stood surrounded by weapons and maps, "there's a whole crowd gathering down at the settlement. Sheriff's there, mayor too, and some folks I don't recognize." Morrison's hands clenched into fists. "I can see that. The question is, what do we do about it?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe this ain't the night for what we planned. Too many eyes watching now." "Maybe you're right," Morrison said slowly. "Maybe it's time for a different approach." As evening settled over the ranch, an unusual scene developed in the open area between the main buildings and the native settlement. What had been planned as a site for violence had transformed into an impromptu gathering place where representatives of the broader community could witness and judge the conflict between Morrison and his workers. Edward, despite his weakened condition, had insisted on being helped outside to participate in what everyone understood might be the final resolution of their struggle. He sat in a chair near the front of the gathered community, his bandaged back serving as silent testimony to the stakes involved. Sheriff Porter took the lead in organizing what amounted to an informal hearing. He positioned himself at the center of the gathering, with Morrison's supporters on one side and the native community on the other. The various witnesses, ranchers, town officials, and journalists formed a loose circle around the proceedings. "Now then," Porter began, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "I'm here because of reports about unsafe working conditions and threats of violence. I'd like to hear from both sides before deciding what action, if any, needs to be taken." Morrison emerged from his ranch house wearing his finest clothes and carrying himself with the dignity of a man confident in his righteousness. He'd spent the past hour preparing for this confrontation, understanding that his reputation and future depended on convincing the assembled witnesses that he was the victim of ungrateful rebellion rather than the architect of systematic oppression. "Sheriff Porter," Morrison began, his voice measured and reasonable, What you're witnessing here is the result of outside agitation, disrupting a peaceful and productive working relationship. These people have been well cared for, given steady employment, and fair compensation for their labor. The rancher gestured toward the settlement with practiced authority. But the arrival of this drifter, he pointed at Edward, has filled their heads with unrealistic expectations and dangerous ideas about challenging legitimate authority. Morrison's performance was polished and convincing, delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. To observers who knew nothing of the daily realities at the ranch, his words might have seemed reasonable. But Thomas Greyhorse had spent too many years watching Morrison manipulate the truth to remain silent. "Sheriff," Thomas said, stepping forward. With quiet dignity, "before you make any judgments, there are some things you should see." The stable master led the group toward the equipment shed where Morrison kept his collection of punishment implements. The sight of the whips, chains, and other instruments of torture drew sharp intakes of breath from the assembled witnesses. "These aren't tools for managing cattle," Thomas explained matter-of-factly. "They're what Morrison uses to maintain discipline among his workers. The man sitting over there," he indicated Edward, "bears the scars of 15 strikes from the largest of these whips. His crime was trying to prevent the punishment of an innocent woman." Sheriff Porter examined the whips with professional interest, noting the bloodstains that Morrison had never bothered to clean completely. "These have been used recently. 3 times in the past month," Thomas confirmed. "On workers who committed such crimes as asking for their wages on time, trying to leave the ranch with their families, and questioning unsafe working conditions." The journalists present began taking notes furiously, recognizing a story that would resonate far beyond the territorial borders. Morrison watched this development with growing alarm, understanding that his reputation was being systematically destroyed in front of witnesses who would carry the story to newspapers across the West. "Those implements are used only in extreme cases of insubordination," Morrison protested. "When workers violate their contracts or threaten the safety of the operation." Little Dove, who had been watching the proceedings with intense concentration, stepped forward from the crowd. Her small figure seemed insignificant next to the assembled adults, but when she spoke, her voice carried the moral authority that had marked all her interventions. "Sheriff Porter," she said clearly, "would you like to hear what Morrison considers extreme insubordination?" The sheriff looked down at the 8-year-old girl with surprise and growing interest. "Go ahead, miss." Joseph Redhawk was whipped for trying to take his sick wife to see a doctor in town without Morrison's permission. Marcus Whitehawk was whipped for teaching his children to read. Sarah Crowfeather was scheduled for punishment because someone claimed she stole grain that was never missing in the first place. Little Dove paused, meeting the eyes of each witness in turn. "And Edward Callahan received 15 strikes because he said it was wrong to whip an innocent woman in front of her children." The impact of her words was immediate and profound. Several of the town officials exchanged meaningful glances, while the journalists continued their frantic note-taking. Robert Hensley shook his head in disgust, and Sheriff Porter's expression grew increasingly grim. "These are serious accusations," Porter said, turning back to Morrison. "How do you respond?" Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled. "The girl is obviously coached," he said desperately. "Children don't understand the complexities of managing a large operation." "I understand right and wrong," Little Dove replied with devastating simplicity. "My grandmother taught me that hurting innocent people is always wrong, no matter what excuses you make." The sheriff looked around the gathered crowd, noting the expressions on both sides. Morrison's remaining supporters looked uncomfortable and uncertain, while the native community showed the quiet dignity of people whose truth was finally being heard. "I think I've heard enough testimony for now," Porter announced. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need to conduct a full investigation into the working conditions at this ranch. Until that investigation is complete, I'm ordering a cessation of all physical punishments and requiring that workers be free to leave if they choose. Morrison's face flushed with rage. You have no authority to dictate how I run my business on my own property. I have authority to investigate reports of assault and unlawful imprisonment, Porter replied steadily. And based on what I've seen and heard tonight, both charges may be warranted. The rancher realized that everything he'd built over 20 years was collapsing around him. His reputation, his authority, his entire way of life, all of it was being destroyed by a collection of workers he'd always considered beneath his notice, and a drifting cowboy who'd had the audacity to challenge his methods. This is all because of him, Morrison said, pointing at Edward with undisguised hatred. Before that troublemaker arrived, everything was peaceful. He's the one who corrupted these people with his seditious ideas. Edward, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke. His voice was still weak from his injuries, but it carried clearly across the gathering. I didn't give them any ideas they didn't already have, he said simply. I just showed them it was possible to act on those ideas and survive. You showed them how to be ungrateful, Morrison spat. How to bite the hand that feeds them. No, Edward replied, meeting Morrison's furious gaze without flinching. I showed them the difference between charity and justice, between survival and dignity, between being broken and being human. The cowboy's words seemed to crystallize everything that had happened over the past week. Morrison's empire hadn't been destroyed by outside agitation or political interference. It had been brought down by the simple recognition that human beings deserved to be treated with basic respect. Sheriff Porter stepped between the two men, sensing that the confrontation had reached a dangerous point. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you to step back and calm down. This situation can still be resolved peacefully if everyone acts reasonably. But Morrison was past the point of reasonable action. Weeks of frustration, the humiliation of public exposure, and the collapse of everything he'd worked to build had pushed him beyond rational thought. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, and several witnesses stepped back in alarm. Nobody destroys Samuel Morrison, he said in a voice that was barely under control. Nobody. The evening air grew tense as everyone present recognized that they were witnessing a man's complete psychological breakdown. Morrison's remaining supporters began backing away, unwilling to be associated with whatever he might do next. Little Dove, however, stepped forward instead of back. Her small figure placed itself directly between Morrison and Edward, just as she had done during the whipping. But this time, her intervention carried a different kind of power. You're already destroyed, Morrison, she said with the calm certainty that had become her trademark. You destroyed yourself the moment you chose to build your power on other people's pain. All we did was show everyone what you really are. Her words hit Morrison like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the fiction he'd constructed about himself. He wasn't a successful rancher bringing civilization to the frontier. He was a petty tyrant whose authority rested on brutality and fear. The realization that an 8-year-old girl could see through him so completely, could articulate his failures with such devastating clarity, finally broke whatever restraint he had left. Morrison's hand closed around his gun grip, and the assembled crowd tensed for violence that would seal his reputation as a madman and criminal. But before he could draw the weapon, another voice cut through the tension. Samuel! Everyone turned to see Frank Holloway approaching from the direction of the bunkhouse, his own gun drawn but pointed at the ground. The foreman's face showed the strain of a man who had wrestled with his conscience and finally chosen a side. Don't do it, Samuel, Holloway said quietly. Don't become the monster they're saying you are. You've got witnesses here from half the territory. Draw that gun and you'll hang for sure. Morrison stared at his former foreman with a mixture of betrayal and desperate hope. "Frank, these people are destroying everything we built together." "We didn't build anything worth saving," Holloway replied sadly. "Not if we built it the way we did. These folks deserve better, and you know it." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge as Morrison struggled between the impulse toward violence and the recognition that he had already lost everything that mattered. His reputation was destroyed, his authority was broken, and even his closest allies had abandoned him. Finally, his hand fell away from his gun, and his shoulders sagged with defeat. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving behind a broken old man who had confused fear with respect and power with worth. Sheriff Porter stepped forward to formally take control of the situation, but the real resolution had already occurred. Morrison's empire had fallen not to violence or political pressure, but to the simple power of truth witnessed by people who refused to look away. 3 months later, the landscape around what had once been Morrison's ranch bore little resemblance to the place where Edward Callahan had first arrived seeking work. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and brutality had been replaced by something unprecedented in the Arizona Territory, a thriving cooperative community where former enemies worked side by side toward common goals. Thomas Greyhorse stood on the porch of the house that had once belonged to Samuel Morrison, reviewing ledgers that showed the remarkable transformation of the ranch's fortunes. As the community's elected manager, Thomas had proven that fair treatment and shared prosperity were not only morally superior to Morrison's methods, but far more profitable as well. The cattle operation had flourished under cooperative management. Workers who had once labored under threat of the whip now took pride in their efforts, leading to improved productivity and animal care. The removal of Morrison's punitive wage system had allowed families to save money and invest in improvements, creating a cycle of growth that benefited everyone. Edward emerged from the stable, moving with the careful gait of a man whose back would never fully recover from 15 strikes of Morrison's whip. The scars had healed, but they remained visible reminders of the price he'd paid for standing up to injustice. Despite the permanent damage, Edward showed no signs of regret about his choice. "How are the books looking?" Edward asked, settling into a chair beside Thomas on the porch. "Better than anyone expected," Thomas replied with satisfaction. "Turns out that when people have a stake in their work's success, they put their hearts into it. Who could have predicted that?" Edward smiled at his friend's gentle sarcasm. The success of their cooperative venture had surprised even sympathetic observers, who had expected the community to struggle without Morrison's iron-fisted management. Instead, they had discovered that shared responsibility and mutual respect were far more effective motivators than fear and brutality. Little Dove appeared around the corner of the house, now 9 years old and having grown several inches taller since the night of the confrontation. She carried herself with the same fierce dignity that had marked her even as a child, but her face had lost some of the hard-earned wisdom that trauma had forced upon her too early. "The delegation from Colorado is here," she announced. "They want to hear about how we organized everything." Word of the Morrison Ranch transformation had spread throughout the West, attracting attention from labor organizers, journalists, and other communities seeking alternatives to the traditional exploitation of workers. The cooperative had become a model for progressive ranching operations, proving that ethical treatment and economic success were not mutually exclusive. "Tell them we'll meet in the main hall in an hour," Thomas said. "And make sure Elena has her herbs ready. These city folks always seem to need something for the altitude." Little Dove grinned and ran off to spread the word. Her role in the community had evolved naturally from moral voice to practical organizer, and she showed remarkable aptitude for managing the complex logistics of their cooperative venture. Frank Holloway approached from the direction of the cattle yards, his hat pushed back and a satisfied expression on his weathered face. The former foreman had been among the first of Morrison's employees to embrace the new system, and his experience with ranch operations had proven invaluable during the transition period. The fall roundup numbers are in, Holloway reported. We're looking at the best year this ranch has ever had. Cattle are healthier, losses are down, and the buyers are paying premium prices for our stock. Edward nodded with satisfaction. Morrison always claimed that harsh discipline was necessary for efficiency. Turns out the opposite was true. Speaking of Morrison, Holloway said, his expression growing more serious, I got word from town yesterday. He's been seen around the saloons, drinking heavily and talking about coming back to reclaim his property. Thomas and Edward exchanged meaningful glances. Morrison's legal challenges to the cooperative's existence had been unsuccessful. The territorial courts had ruled that his systematic abuse of workers voided any claims to their continued labor, and his own abandoned property had been seized to pay outstanding debts. But legal defeats didn't necessarily mean the man had accepted his new reality. How serious a threat is he? Thomas asked. Holloway shrugged. Probably not much. He's broke, has no allies left, and everyone knows what kind of man he really is. But desperate men sometimes do stupid things. Little Dove reappeared as if she'd been listening to their conversation. If Morrison comes back, we'll handle him the same way we handled him before. With truth, witnesses, and the knowledge that we're stronger together than any one person can be alone. Her confidence was infectious, and Edward found himself marveling again at the transformation that had occurred in this remarkable girl. She had grown from a defiant child into a natural leader, someone who understood instinctively that real power came from building others up rather than tearing them down. Besides, Little Dove continued with a mischievous smile, Morrison's not the same man who used to terrorize people with whips and threats. He's just a broken old drunk now, and everyone knows it. As if summoned by their conversation, dust clouds on the horizon announced the approach of a lone rider. The figure was hunched and unsteady in the saddle, and as it drew closer, they could see that it was indeed Samuel Morrison, but a version of the man that bore little resemblance to the powerful rancher who had once ruled this land through fear. Morrison's clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, his once silver hair now completely white and unkempt. His horse was a poor specimen, clearly the best he could afford with his depleted resources. But most striking was his posture. The confident authority that had once defined him had been replaced by the defeated slouch of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. The former rancher rode directly to the main house, dismounting with obvious difficulty. Up close, the effects of months of heavy drinking were clearly visible in his bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. "I want to talk," Morrison announced without preamble, his voice hoarse and uncertain. Thomas stood slowly, positioning himself between Morrison and the others. "You're not welcome here, Morrison. You made your choices, and now you live with the consequences." "I know," Morrison replied, and the defeat in his voice was complete. "I know what I did, what I became. I'm not here to make threats or demands." Edward studied the broken man before them, searching for signs of the violence and cruelty that had once made Morrison so dangerous. What he saw instead was something almost pitiable, a human being who had built his identity on power over others, and had discovered too late that such power was ultimately hollow. "Then why are you here?" Edward asked. Morrison's eyes found Little Dove, and for a moment his expression showed something that might have been recognition of what he had lost when he chose brutality over humanity. "I came to say I was wrong," Morrison said simply. "About everything. About how to treat people. About what makes a man strong. About what really matters in life." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas, Edward, and the others had expected many things from Morrison if he ever returned: threats, demands for restoration, attempts at violence. They had not expected this broken acknowledgement of his failures. Little Dove stepped forward, studying Morrison's face with the same direct gaze that had first challenged his authority months ago. "Do you really understand what you did wrong? Or are you just saying what you think we want to hear? Morrison met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. I turned people into things. I treated human beings like property, like tools that existed. Only for my benefit. I told myself it was necessary, that it was just the way the world worked. But watching what you've built here, he gestured weakly toward the thriving community around them. You proved I was wrong about everything. And what do you want from us now? Thomas asked. Morrison was quiet for so long that they began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Nothing. I don't deserve anything from any of you. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I lost when I chose to be a monster instead of a man. With that, Morrison climbed back onto his horse with painful effort. But before he could ride away, Little Dove called out to him, "Morrison." The former rancher turned back to look at her. My grandmother used to say that it's never too late for a man to choose who he wants to be. Even someone like you could still find a way to help people instead of hurting them. Morrison stared at the girl who had been the catalyst for his downfall. Seeing in her young face the possibility of redemption he had thought was lost forever. Without responding, he rode away toward town, leaving behind the land he had once ruled through fear. As the dust settled from his departure, Thomas put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "That was generous of you, little one." "More generous than he deserved," Little Dove shrugged. "Grandmother also said that showing mercy doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong enough to break the cycle of hurt." Edward watched Morrison's retreating figure disappear into the desert haze, thinking about cycles and choices and the power of small actions to change the world. His 15 strikes had been intended to save one woman from punishment, but they had somehow grown into something much larger, a demonstration that courage was contagious, that dignity was worth any sacrifice, and that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be transformed by people willing to stand up for what was right. Years later, when the story of the Morrison Ranch had become legend throughout the American West, historians would debate the exact mechanisms by which Edward Callahan's sacrifice had catalyzed such profound change. Some would credit his individual heroism, others would point to the community's collective courage, and still others would argue that the transformation was inevitable once people recognized their own power. But Thomas, Gray Horse, and Little Dove knew the truth was simpler and more complex than any of those explanations. Real change happened when ordinary people decided they were willing to pay the price for their principles, and when they discovered that the price of courage was often far less than the cost of cowardice. Edward Callahan had taken 15 strikes to shield a native child from injustice. In return, that child's father and her entire community had given him something more valuable than any wage, the knowledge that his suffering had meaning, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not through violence, but through the simple refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable. The scars on Edward's back would fade with time, but the changes they had helped create would endure for generations. And in a young girl's fierce dedication to justice, in a father's quiet strength, and in a community's newfound courage, the true legacy of those 15 strikes would continue to grow and spread, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of heroism could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.